My name is Kieran O'Conor. I lecture in medieval archaeology at NUI Galway, and today we're just going to speak for a few minutes about Roscommon Abbey. Roscommon Abbey is the building that you see behind me. Now, in a way, the term abbey is a misnomer because it's actually a Dominican priory. It was founded in 1253 by Felim O'Conor, the King of Connacht at the time, for the Dominican order. The Dominican order was founded in the early 13th century by a Spanish priest. The first Dominican houses were founded in Ireland in the 1220s, but Roscommon Priory is regarded as the first Dominican house in Ireland that was founded solely in a Gaelic context. Irish princes, Gaelic Irish princes like Felim O'Conor had patronised the Dominicans before in conjunction with Anglo-Norman lords, for example at Athenry in 1241. And again, I think Felim O'Conor was probably involved in the foundation of Sligo Friary in 1252, but the main patron was Maurice Fitzgerald, an Anglo-Norman lord. So in a way, we can argue that this is the first, if you like, complete Dominican priory founded by a native Irish prince. Why did Felim bring the Dominicans to Roscommon in the mid-13th century? Well, he clearly was impressed by their spirituality and the fact that they were, had already in the 30 years or so, 40 years since they'd been founded, not even 40 years, had gained a reputation for being tremendous preachers and orators. And I think Felim wanted the Dominicans to come and give spiritual guidance through preaching and things like that to the people in the area of Roscommon. Of course, a great prince, if you like, or lord like Felim wanted to patronise the church to atone for sins, but also to show his status as a great lord. This was seen all over Europe at the time. So it's quite interesting, Felim's foundation of Roscommon Priory in the mid-13th century. But why did the Dominicans come to Roscommon? What was in it for them? Well, increasing work is showing that Roscommon, certainly by the 11th or 12th century, if not far earlier, had become a very important monastery. The actual original monastery of Roscommon lay to our north on the site of where the St. Cuman's Church of Ireland church is today. It's clear that there was a lot of intellectual activity being carried out in Roscommon, particularly in the 12th century, under the patronage of the monastery, which adopted the Augustinian rule in the 12th century, but also under the patronage of the O'Conor kings of Connacht. So we think that Roscommon in the mid-13th century, and for at least a century or two beforehand, had become a great centre of learning and also art as well. The Dominicans were associated with learning across Europe at this time. It would also appear that Roscommon, under the O'Conors in the 13th century, had developed into a town. That it was more than just a sort of collection of a few houses. It had actually developed into a small town. And this is kind of interesting because there is one, if you like, scholarly belief that there was little in the way of towns in Gaelic-dominated parts of medieval Ireland, but increasing evidence is showing that that's not the case. So what we have here in 1253, when the Dominicans are brought here by Felim O'Conor, is probably a centre of learning at Roscommon, a centre of metalworking, artistic endeavour, but also an O'Conor administrative centre in this part of their kingdom of Connacht. And we also believe that there was an O'Conor residence on the exact opposite side of town to where we are now, on the northern side, and that may have been a crannog. So all in all, in the mid-13th century, this was an attractive place for the Dominicans to come and build and start their priory. In terms of its history, the history of the priory is very much that of Roscommon throughout the Middle Ages. We have references to priors of Roscommon becoming bishops of Elphin. We have references to academic activity being carried out here. We hear of an O'Conor lector of Roscommon, Dominican friar, who was a famous scholar in the early 14th century. We hear of the priory being burned in the fighting, if you like, between the O'Conors and the Anglo-Normans. We know that Roscommon Priory was burned, I think, in 1270. So things like that. In the mid-15th century, about 1445, we might talk about this a bit later, we hear that the priory has been damaged by war and neglect, and the Dominicans here get a papal indulgence to carry out building repairs. But then with the Reformation, the reconquest of Ireland by the English government in Dublin, Roscommon Abbey is confiscated from, and the small amount of lands attached to the priory, it's confiscated by the Dublin government and eventually is granted to a new English administrator, Sir Nicholas Malby. The Dominicans seem to have left the priory, but they continued to live in the town of Roscommon, and that community existed well into the 19th century. But for our purposes, after about 1570 or so, the priory here was laicized, if you like, and became the property of various new English settlers. Here we are in Roscommon Priory itself, in Roscommon Abbey. We're actually located at present in its nave. Now the thing about abbeys and friaries and priories, and for that matter castles, they were used for many centuries, and over time new repairs, new features were inserted into the building. So what you actually have is chronological depth within the structure. So as we said just a few minutes ago, the abbey was founded in 1253. It's dedicated in 1257, meaning that it probably took 3 or 4 years to actually build the priory here at Roscommon. There is a 13th century phase, but things change over time, needs, different rituals, things like that. And in the mid-15th century, we find that there is a rebuilding of the priory. This just doesn't happen in Roscommon Abbey, but it happens right across the country. The 15th century saw a lot of building of new friaries and priories and rebuildings of older abbeys and priories like Roscommon. What do we know about the Dominican friars who actually lived at and served and worked at Roscommon Priory? We have references to them in the historical sources, particularly in the native annals. And in terms of their status, the priest friars tended to come from the local ruling families, the O'Conors, MacDermots, O'Hanleys, O'Byrnes, and also the old learned families and ecclesiastical families of pre-Norman Ireland, like the O'Conors and O'Dignans. So in a general sense, all are equal in the eyes of God, but some are more equal than others. The priest friars, the actual Dominican friars, tended to come from the upper echelons of society. There were also lay friars, and we do occasionally hear of them. And mostly they come from a lower status background. That's what I meant in one sense. All are equal in the eyes of God, but some are more equal than others. So basically lay friars tended to come from lower status backgrounds, and they did the manual work and odd jobs, if you like, around the priory, while the priest friars tended to do, say mass every day, preach to the laity, give spiritual services to the laity in the vicinity, and also carry out study. Because as I implied earlier, study was very important to the Dominicans throughout their existence. In a general sense, the Dominicans were not supposed to personally own property. They were to live a life of austerity and poverty, whether they were ordained friars or lay friars. And normally what would happen is that the local families would donate food, money, etc. to the friars. But it's also clear, at least in Ireland, and I'm not sure if this happens elsewhere in medieval Europe at this time, that there was a small farm attached to the friary, presumably to grow food, grow vegetables and crops, maybe a small dairy herd, some sheep. The produce was not sold for profit, but was used by the friars themselves. In other words, they were somewhat self-sufficient in terms of food. And we know at Roscommon that the priory here seemed to have had about 50 acres attached to it. So it's not like the monasteries of the time, we'll say Cistercian monasteries in the 13th century, had literally owned thousands of acres and farmed vast tracts of land for profit. The Dominicans were poor, they maintained that. They relied on donations, as I say, from local people, but there does appear to have been a small farm attached to the priory. And that might be a little different to what was happening, at least in places like England or Eastern Ireland at the time. At the west end of the priory church, the west gable. Now remember I said a couple of minutes ago that we can see two architectural phases in this particular church. The original mid-13th century phase, and then a rebuilding and renovation in the mid-15th century. And what we're going to do now is look through the building, the church, and try and figure out what exactly belongs to the 13th century that's original to the church when it was first built. And then when we finish that, we'll come back out here and go through the mid-15th century a renovation. Okay, so we're here at the west gable. What do we see? The remains of a clear 15th century inserted window, but on either side we see blocked up lancet windows. They are original to the church as it was built in the mid-13th century, and they're blocked up in the 15th century. That's quite clear, and it's so clear here. This is why we bring students from NUI Galway to look at this. So we're looking at a 13th century phase and an inserted window of 15th century. Now originally, you've got to imagine that trace reed window inserted in the mid-15th century was not there, obviously, in the 13th century when the friary or priory was founded. And we know from analogy elsewhere that there would have been a central lancet. So you would have had three long lancet pointed windows lighting the west gable of the church, lighting the nave of the church. We see a doorway there today, but that's clearly a reconstructed or constructed structure of modern date, maybe rebuilt or inserted in the 20th century. We're not quite sure at Roscommon if there was originally a doorway at the western end of the church, because we know from antiquarian sources that there was a doorway on the northern wall of the nave of the church. We're now going to go into the nave and look at it. So the main thing there is 13th century lancets blocked up in the 15th century with an inserted window at that time in the mid 15th century, destroying the central lancet. Okay, we're moving into the nave. The nave is at the western end of the church, and this is where the laity, local lay people, would have come to hear Mass, but also to be preached to by the Dominicans. The thing about this particular nave is it has a unique feature, and that is it has an aisle on its northern side. So in terms of internal area, this nave is very large. And you know, when we were working here, we were thinking, okay, the nave is where the laity came and where, you know, the Dominicans preached to the laity from a pulpit behind me. And also, obviously, Mass, they heard Mass here, things like that. Why is the nave so big? Because normally the nave of a Dominican, or for that matter a Franciscan friary, who are also a mendicant order like the Dominicans, was usually long and narrow. Here it has an extra aisle, if you like, attached onto its northern side. People will say, well, is that 15th century? Is that part of the renovation of the 15th century? No, it's not. It was original to the mid 13th century church. And it seems to me that perhaps one of the reasons why there's such a large nave was that both the Dominicans and Felim O'Conor, as King of Connacht, their patron and founder, realised that because Roscommon, not only was there a nucleated settlement at Roscommon, but also that it was a centre of pilgrimage, and that at certain times of the year large amounts of people visited Roscommon. We also think that the parochial system in the Diocese of Elphin in the 13th century was not as organised as dioceses further east. And overall, it could be that because Roscommon was a centre of pilgrimage, because there wasn't the same level of, we'll say, spiritual care and things like that within the Diocese of Elphin at the time, that basically the Dominicans were expecting large numbers of people to come into the nave and therefore to hear, if you like, their sermons, to hear Mass, and that's why the aisle is, the original church had an aisle on its northern side, making its internal area much bigger than the average Dominican, or for that matter, as I say, Franciscan friary. So originally there would have been tombs of local lords, merchants, well-to-do people actually located in these niches, which lie on the southern wall of the nave of the priory church. So originally tomb niches. And actually the other thing you can see is the original mortar render on the wall, and we must remember that, because what we see now is basically stone walls, but they would have been plastered originally, whitewashed, and also probably had red and ochre lines pretending to be ashlar masonry painted onto them. But I think the main thing is that the walls would have been plastered and whitewashed, perhaps with some simple painting, looking at the external southern wall of the nave. And the windows that you see above me there are original 13th century lancet windows. And we know from antiquarian sources that the northern wall of the nave church, the northern wall actually of the aisle, also had similar lancets. These are classic 13th century lancet windows. So we know that that's part of the original 13th century church as built in the 1250s of the priory church. And originally we would have had claustral buildings existing here. How do we know there were buildings here? How do we know? Well, first of all, we can see the scar of the roof up here, a scar of a roof. We can also just about make out humps and bumps in this field. We can see the remains of a wall coming out, one of the walls. And basically we would have had a range around a central grassy area called the Cloister Garth, and various buildings, of some of which were 2 stories in height, a ground floor and a first floor. Basically we would have had the sacristy, although that's a little different here, but we would have had the chapter house on the eastern side of this range, on the east range of these buildings. As I said, a central grassy area, above which you would have had the friars' dormitory at first floor level. The chapter house was where basically the business of the friary was discussed each day. Prayers were said there, meetings were held there. And what's interesting about the chapter house at Roscommon, and indeed this whole area, is that the discovery programme carried out geophysical survey here about 10 years ago, and they picked up the walls, the foundations of this range, the claustral range to the south of the priory church, but they showed that the chapter house jutted out eastwards and was actually quite a large chapter house in comparison to other chapter houses in Ireland, in 13th century Ireland. And that may be an indication that there were quite a few Dominican friars and lay friars at Roscommon at that time. What else? On the southern side of this range you would have had the kitchen and the dining room, the friars' dining room. And also we probably had garderobes or lavatories as well somewhere in the vicinity. Probably that southern range did not have, was not of 2 floors, it was only a ground floor. Kitchen and refectory, where the friars would have ate. Again, the tables ranged around the wall, probably with a lectern in the middle, and the friars would listen to one of their brethren read from the Bible or Gospel or whatever during mealtime. And then where we are on this western side, you would have had cellars, where food and things like that was stored. And then at first floor level we would have had the accommodation for the lay friars. And we can see that there's a blocked up doorway behind me where the lay friars would have filed into the church at night during night offices. We're now in the choir or chancel of the priory church. The nave, where the laity would have heard mass and been preached to by the Dominican friars, was separated from this choir area in the 13th and 14th century by a rood screen, a wooden rood screen, which was basically a wooden screen with a cross on top of it. I think it's probably the best way to describe it. The laity would not really have seen this part of the church. We know that the northern wall of the choir from antiquarian sources had very similar lancet windows to what we see in the what we just saw in the nave, but they were taken down sometime during in the 19th century, with the stone being robbed out. You also see 19th century burials within the church. Over here, as we move through the choir, where the ordained friars would have sat during Mass and the various offices of the day, we move through and we're moving into the sanctuary area where the high altar would have been located. Just here, presumably a stone altar. To the north of the high altar, we have the remains of the founder's tomb. This is where Felim O'Conor, the King of Connacht, was buried when he died in 1265. His family put this carved effigy over his grave. Lay founders like Felim O'Conor had the right to burial on the northern side or gospel side of the sanctuary. The effigy is, I think it's the left hand is clasping a rosary or crucifix, holiness, and then the right hand is holding a royal wand of office, probably with a fleur-de-lis. Okay? The effigy, the figure in the effigy has long robes, and his feet are resting on a dog while his head is resting on some form of pillow. This effigy is depicting a royal personage. So we think that Felim O'Conor's son, Hugh, is making a statement about the royal nature, or the royal, if you like, the royal nature of the O'Conor line, who are then under pressure from the Anglo-Normans. But it's reminding everybody that the O'Conors are a royal line, and that Felim was a king in his lifetime. So to me, it's a form of propaganda. Now, there's quite a lot of argument about this tomb and what it represents, but that's what I see it. I actually see it as a symbol of resistance. To me, the idea that Felim's family are placing an effigy of a king of European stature over his grave is a statement about them and their position in the world. But at that stage, they're under threat from Anglo-Norman / English encroachments. So if we move on, as I said, the stone altar, great high altar, would have been here. To our left, we can see a corbel that would have, would have held a statue, maybe of St. Dominic. We can see on the other side as well, there was probably a statue to probably Dominican saint like St. Peter Martyr. As I say, the altar would have been here, lit by 3 lancets. Now, the window we're looking at present is a 15th century traceried inserted window. To the left and to the right, you can see the remains of the blocked up lancet windows. So originally, just like the west gable wall of the nave, we would have had 3 long lancets overlooking the high altar. Again, each morning, the first offices of the day, light would come in, obviously, to help those saying Mass, the Dominican friars, but also, of course, the altar in the east gable, lit by the rising sun, is symbolic of the risen Christ. Okay, if we turn to our right, we can see the remains of the piscina. Now, obviously, this has been restored at some stage in the last century, but most of it is original. A piscina was a niche for washing holy vessels. And you can see the rosette and then the drain hole where the sacred water, if you like, would have drained into the body of the church. You couldn't just throw out that water. But anyway, here's the piscina. How do we know it's 13th century? Well, again, if you look here, you can see the striations, and that is what we call diagonal tooling. You see the striations just there? Diagonal tooling, and that is classic 13th century stone dressing. Okay, so we know this is original. We move down a little bit and we can see another niche, which again has been restored in the last 100 years or so. But this is the sedilia. And originally there would have been a bench here for the clergy, for the Dominican friars saying Mass. This is where they would have sat during the service, whenever they sat down. So a sedilia was a seat space. A wooden seat would have existed here. If we move down this southern wall of the choir, we see the remains of one side of a doorway, and we believe that to be the part of the doorway into the sacristy, which would have lay to the south of the original friary. The sacristy would have been where the holy vessels and vestments and books used in Mass and the various offices that the Dominicans would have carried out during the day and night. I mean, they were getting up a couple of times during the night as well to say various offices, but the sacristy would have lain directly to our south, behind the sedilia. And what's interesting about the sacristy in this building is that there appears to have been a room overhead. And it's been argued by my colleague Dan Titch-Tyler, who did the reconstruction drawings for the guidebook, that room, because it was well lit, with an east and south facing, would have possibly maybe been a scriptorium, but that's maybe interesting. So going down the wall, we see a blocked up doorway, and that was the doorway from the church into the claustral buildings to our south. So what were the claustral buildings? The claustral buildings were the administrative and residential part of the friary. We're in the church is the one that's surviving, but the claustral buildings lay to the south, and that's where the friars lived, ate, and carried out daily chores. Right, so we've looked through the original Dominican priory as built in the mid-13th century, built over a 4-year period, we think. Remember that there are claustral buildings to our south, so not just the church when you're visiting here, remember that. But now we're moving on to that 15th century phase. And in 1445, we hear that a papal indulgence was granted to allow people donate money and resources to the Dominicans here to repair the priory because it had been damaged by war. The west wall of the nave that we see behind us, the original lancets, the left and right hand one, were blocked up, and the central lancet window was destroyed, and a massive traceried window, 4 lights in width, was inserted. A very, very fine window, flowing tracery, all joined together. But if we look on the northern side of the divide between the choir and the nave, we find that an extension known as a transept was built on to the north wall of the church. Quite a large transept. So why did they do that? Well, one reason is that 2 extra altars would have been placed under the east windows in this extension, and extra masses could have been said a day for various local worthies, or deceased local worthies, which would have increased, I suppose, the income that came into the Dominican priory. We know that there was originally a traceried window in that large pointed north window, but again that seems to have been demolished in the 19th century. So a traceried window quite similar to the one we just discussed that was inserted into the west gable of the Priory Church. Classic 15th century stone dressing. You can see up there dressed stone in 15th century style, maybe late 14th, 15th, 16th century style, known as punch dressing. So a different form of dressing is now used to dress the stone on arches and doorways. Again, we know from antiquarian sources, late 18th century drawings of Roscommon Priory, that a tower was placed between the choir and the nave, a 3-story tower. From my reading of the late 18th century drawing, or understanding of the late 18th century drawing, it was very similar to the tower at Roscommon Abbey in County Mayo, and different to the average Dominican Franciscan tower at the time, insofar that the tower extended right across the church. But it was 3 stories in height. We think maybe the prior's room would have been at first floor level. But remember, you know, that creates an even greater divide, if you like, between the nave for the laity and the choir for the ordained friars, Dominican friars. But the wooden rood screen, I'd say, still existed, dividing the two, but now there was a 3-story tower as well, and that tower fell down in the late 18th and 19th century, and the stone, like so much of the stone here, was carted away and presumably used for building purposes in Roscommon town. Just like the west gable of the church, the original 13th century lancets were either destroyed or blocked up, and an absolutely massive traceried window was put in here circa 1445, 1450, in my opinion. And there it is. Now originally it was 5 lights in width, and a whole load of sort of flowing tracery would have existed in its sort of upper bits. Okay, so a very fine window was inserted. We also see something else. The sedilia was clearly, work was carried out on it, and these finials that we see just here, carved finials, are also 15th century work. We think again, we're not 100% sure, but we think again sometime around the middle of the century. Now lastly, we come back to the founder's tomb, and as I said to you, this frontal does not belong to Felim O'Conor's tomb. It comes from another tomb, and when we look at its detail, we realise that it is also late medieval in date, possibly 15th century. Our feeling is that it's the end parts, the two end parts, we can see they're not joined together, of a tomb that maybe existed in the transept, and it was just moved here when this whole area was restored in the late 19th century. Let's just summarize then 15th century rebuilding. We know that windows were inserted in the east gable above the high altar, the west gable as well, another one. A transept was built on the northern side of the Priory Church. We have a very fine 3-story high tower built between the choir and the nave. We have evidence of a very finely, ornately carved tomb, which, by the way, may be the tomb of Felim O'Conor Rowe. We also have strong hints that the claustral area was partly rebuilt. The buildings to our south, of which only really the foundations can be seen today. Okay, well, what does all this mean? Well, one of the things about places like Roscommon that lay in Gaelic Ireland, in other words, the parts of Ireland that remained under the control of Gaelic princes, native Irish, Gaelic Irish princes and lords, is that we have very little in the way of detailed surviving socio-economic documents. The equivalent of, we'll say, of manorial extents or inquisitions post-mortem. There isn't a lot of really detailed information, okay? And this has led some people to say, we're talking about Roscommon, but specifically say about Gaelic Ireland, that somehow it was not terribly well developed in the 15th century. Specifically, somebody said because there's no references or real references to much in the way of economic activity at Roscommon in the 15th century, nothing really was happening. Now, firstly, we can say that from the point of view, the physical remains of the priory, that this was not the case. To be able to carry out that level of rebuilding in the 15th century, remembering that the Dominicans had little in the way of property themselves, is an indication that Roscommon and its area possessed the resources and wealth. The archaeology is showing us that there was massive rebuilding here, and that is an indication of wealth in the area in the 15th century. So Gaelic Roscommon, under people like the O'Conors and McDermotts, was a much richer place than, we'll say, the surviving documents would suggest. So that's the importance of what we're looking at here. I mean, I might add that Leask, looking at the window over my head, Leask, the great architectural historian of 20th century Ireland, reckoned that the east window at Roscommon, as inserted into the east gable above the main altar in the 15th century, was one of the finest windows in the country. Now that's fantastic. But that's an indication, has to be an indication of wealth. So if you like, archaeology, the architecture is telling us something different and telling us more about Roscommon than the historical documents do at the time.